They dragged a 15-year-old into the tunnels beneath the Colosseum. The smell of blood and animal dung filled the air. 50,000 voices roared above, and then the nightmare began. What they did to captive women below Rome's greatest arena changed an empire. Why did officials hide the truth for 2,000 years? Rome, 100 AD, marble and gold on the surface, rotten industry underneath. Listen, 1 out of every 3 people in the empire was a slave. 60 million human beings cataloged as property. Not servants, property. Picture the Colosseum, 50,000 seats, 28 elevators lifting beasts from the dark, a retractable awning manned by sailors, drains for mock naval battles, theater engineered like a small city. But below that splendor were dozens of holding cells, and most didn't hold gladiators. They held women. War captives from Germania, Britannia, North Africa. Women arrested for being Christian, for refusing a marriage, or for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They weren't queued up for a fight. They were queued up for something far worse. Death would have been mercy. For centuries, historians obsessed over weapons, diets, training regimens, the gladiator as hero. What the textbooks call spectacle they washed in grace paint and myth. They glossed over the tunnels. They sanitized and organized, ritualized horror with polite phrases, preliminary entertainments. Then, in 1952, a restorer working in the Hypogeum, the underground labyrinth under the arena floor, found graffiti carved into stone. 6 Latin words, ragged and furious. Translated, they took her screaming, "Mars, forgive us. Mars, god of war." Not mercy, not pardon, war. Why would a Roman ask a war god for forgiveness after watching something in the arena? That question is the thread that pulls at everything else. Because this isn't rumor. It's written into law, recorded in church letters, described by eyewitness Roman writers. The state planned it. The Senate regulated it. Vendors scheduled it. Roman law even created legal categories for certain women. Infamous, stripped of all protection. Once labeled, you had no rights. The crowd bought wine. Children ate. Families treated it like Sunday entertainment. Guards opened the cell and led the women into a stage set that had been engineered for cruelty. Stay with me, because the next detail is a legal phrase most modern books avoid. And the one thing that makes this not only cruelty, but a system. The Romans had a term for it, damnatio ad lupana, condemnation to the brothel. But the brothel wasn't across town. It was the arena itself, before the main events, before the gladiator duels, before the animal hunts. Guards brought out the female captives. Roman law, specifically the Lex Julia Divi Publica, classified certain women as infams, dishonored, stripped of humanity. Once you were labeled that, Rome no longer recognized you as a person. You became a prop for entertainment. This wasn't a rumor or fringe tradition. It was scheduled. The Ludi Romani, Rome's great games, always included preliminary entertainments. Vendors sold wine. Children watched. Families chatted. The crowd knew exactly what was coming, and yet it was framed as routine festival entertainment. And here's the disturbing part that modern textbooks rarely spell out. The gladiators weren't the villains. Most were slaves themselves, forced to participate in a system of industrialized humiliation. Records from the Spartacus revolt in 73 BC even mention that one of the rebels' demands was an end to the women. Rewards, translation, this had been happening for over a century before the Colosseum was even built. Now imagine the tunnels. Imagine you're chained in a cell that smells of death and wet stone. You hear the rising chant of the crowd above, a living animal hungry for spectacle. You know what comes next, because no one sent to the tunnels ever returned. Some fought back. One woman, her name lost to time, refused. Tertullian, an early Christian writer, documented her story. She injured to guards when they came for her. The officials couldn't allow defiance, so they chose Rome's most infamous execution method, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But that phrase hides the truth. What Rome practiced wasn't simple violence. It was theater, engineered, rehearsed, and staged to look like living mythology. They didn't just kill people. They turned executions into scripted performances. What came next was a kind of cruelty that didn't just aim to kill the body. It aimed to turn murder into a spectacle the crowd would never forget, and the woman who resisted. Her execution was designed to make an example of her and to terrify anyone who dared show the slightest trace of a will. The myth they chose for her wasn't random, and the details will make your blood run cold. Rome called it damnatio ad bestias, but the name barely captures the horror. The crowd imagined victims thrown to wild animals. The truth was far more calculated and far more theatrical. The Romans loved mythology, Hercules, Prometheus, Pasiphae, but they had one twisted innovation. What if the myths weren't stories, but scripts? What if the victim wasn't pretending, but actually dying? They called these productions fatal charades, executions disguised as mythological reenactments, staged with the precision of a military operation. The woman who resisted the guards was forced into the myth of Prometheus. Prometheus stole fire from the gods. So Zeus chained him to a rock where an eagle devoured his liver over and over. The Romans recreated it, literally. They chained her to a post in the arena, dressed her as Prometheus, and released a trained eagle, not a random wild animal. A trained one. Its attacks were slow, calculated. Tertullian writes that the eagle struck her 3 separate times before she finally died. The crowd watched for hours, eating, cheering, placing bets on how long she'd survive. And here's the detail scholars hardly mention. The animals were trained not to kill too fast. Manuals survived, actual Roman training guides explaining how to condition leopards, bears, even bulls to wound without delivering a quick death. This wasn't barbarism. It was infrastructure. The Colosseum's underground system, the hypogeum, had pulleys, trapdoors, stage lifts, and machinery mapped by archaeologists. They had set designers, animal handlers, and specialist roles like the carcerarius, the costume supervisor for fatal performances. The myth of Pasiphae was another infamous example. The poet Martial describes a woman dressed as the cursed queen and brought before an actual bull. Some once dismissed this as poetic exaggeration, until Josephus, an eyewitness historian, confirmed a similar spectacle, a woman tied to a bull and dragged to death. During Emperor Titus's games. Myth turned literal. Death disguised as theater, a ritual of humiliation and spectacle, repeated again and again with women chosen specifically for the roles involving violation or slow suffering. And yet, as horrific as these staged deaths were, they weren't the darkest layer, because the Colosseum wasn't just killing people on stage, it was keeping them alive beneath it, for something much worse. The evidence for that didn't surface until 2019, and it changed everything we thought. We knew about the arena. For centuries, scholars believed we understood the Colosseum's brutality. We knew about the executions, the gladiator fights, the animal hunts. But in 2019, archaeologists uncovered something no one expected, something that forced them to stop digging. During routine maintenance on the Colosseum's eastern foundation, workers struck unstable ground. The floor collapsed, revealing a chamber no historical map had ever recorded. Inside was a burial site, hidden, sealed, forgotten. What the team found over the next 8 months horrified even seasoned forensic experts. 173 skeletons, all female, all from the Colosseum's active period between 80 and 300 AD, all showing trauma. But it wasn't the number that froze the researchers. It was the patterns. Dr. Alessandra Giovannini, the lead archaeologist, documented 3 disturbing findings. 1. Malnutrition without starvation. These women weren't left to waste away. They were fed just enough to survive, the caloric minimum needed to keep a body functioning. That means they were held long-term. 2. Healed fractures, broken bones that had mended. These women had been injured, survived, and were kept alive to be used again. This wasn't execution. It was a system of repeated exploitation. 3. Grooves in the ankle and wrist bones, signs of restraints worn not for hours, but for months. Some of the deepest grooves indicated shackles so tight the metal gradually shaped the bone. And then came the DNA report, the one that made international headlines, and vanished within a week. The women weren't Roman. They came from Germania, North Africa, Britannia, the Middle East, a cross-section of Rome's conquered world, ages 12 to 30. 12. But the most shocking results came from biochemical analysis. Their final meals were luxurious. Imported figs, wine, seafood reserved for religious ceremonies. Why feed prisoners like royalty right before death? Because Rome saw them as sacrificial offerings. Victims purified through ritual diets before being killed for the crowd. And then came the finding that forced the government to seal the chamber. Multiple skeletons showed evidence of pregnancy. Late-term pregnancy. The implication is almost unthinkable. Either there was a breeding program, or women were kept alive through childbirth and then used in the games afterward. But one skeleton, labeled Subject 47, changed everything. She died clutching something so tightly her bones had fused around it. It took weeks to separate. A tiny, roughly carved wooden cross she died holding. The symbol of a banned faith Rome was desperate to erase. And one girl, just 15 years old, would turn that symbol into a rebellion that shook the empire. If you're ready, the story returns to Blondina. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because she didn't know how to. Her voice was trembling, barely working, like every word was fighting its way out of her throat. Finally, she whispered, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. The hall stayed silent. It wasn't the apology that mattered. It was the fact that she had spoken at all. A woman, during a meal, inside a Spartan men's hall. That single syllable had placed her life on a knife's edge. The soldier who had mocked her earlier suddenly looked away, as if even eye contact might make him guilty by association. Others stared with a strange mix of pity and relief that it wasn't them. Then the commander stepped forward. Not slowly, not angrily, but with the cold, mechanical discipline of a man who has done this before. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply asked her a question. Who taught you to speak? Her face collapsed. She didn't understand. But this wasn't about understanding. It was about procedure, a system, a rule carved deeper than any battle scar. The guards seized her again, this time with no hesitation. They weren't dragging her toward the exit. They were turning her toward the inner chambers of the hall. The room didn't erupt with outrage. It didn't protest. It didn't even whisper. Because in this culture, what was about to happen wasn't shocking. It was expected. A woman speaking during a meal was seen as an act of disruption, a challenge to mail order, discipline and structure, a threat, and in ancient Sparta, threats, no matter how small, were dealt with ruthlessly. As they carried her toward the stone doorway, she looked back once, searching the eyes of warriors who never looked at her again. Her fate was sealed the moment that single breath escaped her lips. Behind that stone doorway was a narrow corridor, cold, echoing, and far quieter than the hall she had just been dragged from. Here, torches burned low. Shadows stretched long across the walls, almost swallowing the small figure being escorted forward. The guards didn't speak. They didn't explain anything, because they didn't have to. Every Spartan woman knew what this corridor meant. Still trembling, she whispered, Please, I didn't know. One guard finally replied, not with cruelty, but with the dull resignation of someone delivering a fact. Ignorance is not innocence. Those 4 words crushed what little hope she had left. At the end of the corridor stood a wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. It opened with a long, painful groan, revealing a dim chamber lit by a single oil lamp. In the center was a stone chair, not quite a throne, not quite a torture device, but something unsettlingly in between, a place where women were judged, not by evidence, not by intent, but by expectation. The commander entered behind her, his footsteps steady, almost ceremonial. He circled her slowly, like she was not a person, but a violation that needed classification. Do you understand? He said softly, Why speaking here is forbidden. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. The commander didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. That would have implied emotion, and this ritual had none. It is not the word that matters. He continued, It is the moment in which it is spoken. Men eat, men speak, women observe. Then came the sentence, short, final, unbreakable. You disrupted discipline. You will be corrected. The guards tightened their grip. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, because everyone knew, in Sparta, correction didn't mean punishment. It meant transformation, and no woman walked out of that chamber the same. They placed her onto the stone chair. It was cold, so cold it felt alive, as if it had absorbed the fear of every woman who sat there before her. Leather straps hung from its arms and legs, not tight yet, but waiting. The commander stood behind her, hands folded behind his back, speaking with the calmness of a physician, not an executioner. Spartan order is not maintained by strength alone, he said. It is maintained by silence. Silence keeps the mind steady. Silence preserves hierarchy. Silence protects discipline. Then he leaned forward just enough for his breath to brush her ear. And discipline is worth more than any single life. She gasped. It wasn't a scream, just a small sound of terror escaping her chest. The guards heard it. They began tightening the straps, her wrists, her ankles, her waist, each strap pulled with slow precision, as if they were measuring her fear. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes darted across the room, searching for a door, a window, a miracle. There was none. The only thing in front of her was a small bronze bowl and a wooden rod carved with ancient markings. A tool, a symbol, a warning passed through generations. One guard picked it up. Her heart dropped. The commander explained, not to be kind, but because explaining was part of the ritual itself. When a woman forgets to hold her tongue, he said, we do not take her voice. We simply remind her who it belongs to. He gestured to the guard. The bowl was filled with a pale resin, thick, sticky, bitter-smelling. He dipped the wooden rod into it. She struggled now, really struggled, the straps digging into her skin, as she fought with everything she had left. No, please don't. I swear I won't speak again, I swear. But please had no power here. This chamber was designed for one purpose, to break the voice without shedding a drop of blood. The guard stepped closer, lifting the rod toward her mouth, and in that moment, she realized something horrifying. This wasn't punishment. This was tradition. The wooden rod hovered just inches from her lips, thick with that pale resin, its scent sharp enough to sting her eyes. She turned her face away, but the guards held her head still. Firm hands, no hesitation, like they'd done this hundreds of times before. Her breath came in broken bursts. She tried to keep her mouth shut, but the commander spoke again, calm, inevitable, open. She shook her head violently. Open, he repeated. Not louder, not angrier, just absolute. Her lips stayed pressed together. She thought resisting might save her, maybe even change their minds. But Spartans didn't change their minds. The commander gave the slightest nod. One guard pinched her nose hard, cutting off her air. Her lungs tightened. Her chest burned. She held her breath. 5 seconds. 8, 10. Until survival forced her mouth open with a desperate gasp. And that was all they needed. The rod slid in. The resin-coated wood pressed against her tongue, scraping it, coating it, burning it. She gagged instantly, not from pain, but from instinct. The resin wasn't meant to wound. It was meant to scar taste itself, to make speaking feel unnatural, to make words come out thick, slurred, broken. The guard twisted the rod slowly, a full circle, making sure every surface inside her mouth was coated with the numbing, bitter mixture. Her cries dissolved into choked gasps. Her eyes flooded with tears, but no one reacted. This was not torture. This was maintenance, a social mechanism disguised as ritual. When the rod was finally pulled out, thin strings of the pale resin stretched between her teeth. She tried to speak, to plead, to beg, but the sound that escaped wasn't a word. It wasn't even a whisper, just a garbled, trembling noise that didn't sound human. The commander watched her try again, and again, each time worse than the last. Then he nodded, satisfied. Correction complete. The straps unbuckled. Her arms fell uselessly to her sides. Her mouth quivered, as if her own voice had turned against her. And for the first time, the warriors outside would hear what she had become, a woman who could no longer speak clearly, even if her life depended on it. When the guards finally lifted her from the chair, her legs nearly collapsed beneath her, not from injury, but from the shock of what had just been taken from her. Her tongue felt swollen, heavy, as if someone had replaced it with a stone. Every attempt at a word dissolved into a slurred murmur. They didn't drag her now. They simply guided her, to hands on her arms, steady, emotionless, back through the same corridor she had entered only minutes earlier. Minutes. but she felt centuries older. As they walked, she heard the distant rumble of voices from the hall, men laughing, eating, talking freely, all the things she would never experience the same way again. Each step closer to the exit felt like a step away from the woman she had been before that single accidental word escaped her mouth. At the end of the corridor, the heavy door leading back to the hall creaked open. The torchlight and noise washed over her, warm, alive, a world she no longer belonged to. When she stepped inside, the hall fell silent again. Every warrior turned, not with cruelty, not with sympathy, just acknowledgement. They had all seen this before. She tried to speak, to tell them she'd made a mistake, that she hadn't meant to interrupt, that she didn't deserve this, but the sound that escaped her was a fractured groan, a trembling syllable that didn't form anything recognizable. A murmur rippled through the room. Not pity, not mockery, just confirmation. The commander stepped out behind her. Addressing the hall, order has been restored. The warriors nodded once and returned to their meal. Just like that, as if nothing had happened, because in their world, nothing had. She backed away slowly, her breath shaking, her mouth burning with bitterness and shame. No one stopped her. No one followed. Her punishment didn't require guards or walls. She had been corrected, and from this day forward, every word she tried to speak would remind her of the moment her voice was taken away. After that day, she learned a truth every Spartan girl knew by heart. Silence could save your body, but it would never reclaim your soul. Her friends whispered warnings in the hallways, but she could barely respond. Even a cough betrayed her now. A trembling syllable could be noticed, recorded, judged. The corridor, the chair, the resin-coated rod, they weren't just instruments of punishment. They were a lesson carved into memory, designed to last a lifetime. And yet, even in that oppressive silence, something remarkable began to stir. The women around her, those who had watched countless girls endure this ritual, started noticing her defiance. Not her voice, but her eyes, her posture, the tiny, imperceptible flinch that betrayed fear but refused submission. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the commanders saw it too, and that made it dangerous. For weeks, they tested her. Small provocations, tasks that required her to speak, or else. She complied, barely, her voice broken, every word a reminder of the power the ritual held over her. And yet, inside, she swore something no one could take away. She would not be crushed entirely, because in the shadows of Sparta, where girls endured the cold iron of discipline, a mind could remain free even if the body was bound. And her defiance, quiet as it was, began to ripple outward. Other girls began to notice her courage. Even the gladiator slaves themselves noticed. A subtle shift in behavior emerged. Rules could be enforced, but spirits, those could not be fully broken. The commanders didn't yet understand it. They saw compliance on the surface, but they underestimated the echo of courage that lived beneath the surface. The small, almost invisible rebellion was the seed of something far larger. Because when a system depends on fear, the tiniest crack in obedience can eventually shatter the entire structure. And that's exactly what would happen, not just in Sparta, not just in one hall, but across the empire. Because one girl's quiet defiance would eventually inspire others and ripple through history in ways the commanders could never have predicted. Fast forward decades later to Rome itself. 15-year-old Blondina, a Christian slave from Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, France, faced horrors that would make even the Spartan ritual seem mild. She had been arrested simply for her faith, transported to Rome in 177 AD for execution during the Games. She joined dozens of other women who were marked for the arena's preliminary entertainments. The first day, she was chained to a post and exposed to wild animals, lions, bears, even a trained bull. But witnesses recorded something extraordinary. The animals refused to attack. The crowd murmured. Superstitious whispers spread. Some saw it as a divine sign. On the second day, Blondina faced damnatio ad lupana, being offered to the gladiators. But one gladiator, Marcus, refused. He was executed on the spot. 2 more refused. Chaos erupted. The emperor's representative had to intervene. The third day was even worse. She was scourged 40 times with a flagrum, a whip embedded with bone, and metal designed to flay flesh. Then she was placed in a red-hot iron chair. Finally, she was thrown into a net and exposed to a bull. And yet, her defiance remained. Her courage created a political crisis. The games, meant to display Rome's power and divine favor, instead revealed a system dependent on coercion and forced participation. Blondina's stand exposed the cruelty and fragility of the Roman spectacle itself. Within 25 years, legal reforms appeared. Septimius Severus and later Theodosian code laws restricted the use of female captives in preliminary entertainments. For the first time, Rome officially recognized that damnatio ad bestias could constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Even though executions continued, Blondina's story spread. Letters describing her martyrdom were copied and shared across Christian communities. She became a symbol churches were named after her. Her feast day, June 2nd, is still observed today. Ironically, the system designed to erase Christianity ended up preserving its texts. By recording the atrocities, the Romans accidentally created enduring propaganda. Within a century and a half, Christianity grew strong enough to influence emperors. By 325 AD, Constantine had converted. The lethal spectacles ended. The Colosseum transitioned from a symbol of absolute power to one of moral reflection. But it's important to remember, it wasn't empathy that ended the games, it was societal collapse, resource strain, and the unstoppable rise of a new belief system. The women of the arenas didn't die in vain. Their suffering echoed through time, shaping laws, faith, and the eventual fall of pagan Rome. Even after Blondina and countless others, the Colosseum continued its dark legacy for decades. The last recorded damnatio ad bestias occurred in 404 AD. A monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena to stop a gladiator fight. The crowd stoned him to death, but Emperor Honorius, horrified by the incident, permanently banned gladiatorial combat 3 days later. By then, hundreds of women had perished. Hundreds more had endured weeks, months, or years of repeated trauma. And yet, their stories, once buried in silence, survived in letters, inscriptions, and now archaeology. In 2019, the Colosseum revealed one of its deepest secrets, a hidden burial chamber beneath the eastern foundation. Excavated over 8 months by Dr. Alessandra Giovannini and her team, it contained 173 female skeletons dating between 80 to 300 AD. The findings were harrowing. Malnutrition without starvation. They were fed just enough to survive. Healed. Fractures, evidence of repeated injuries, and survival for future use. Grooves on wrist and ankle bones, long-term. Restraints, DNA confirmed they were not Roman. Girls and women from Germania, Britannia, North Africa, and the Middle East, ages ranged from 12 to 30. Chemical analysis revealed something even more chilling. Their final meals were rich fish, wine, imported fruits. Rome believed sacrificial victims should be ritually purified before death. Some skeletons even showed signs of pregnancy, suggesting forced reproduction or ritualized use of pregnant women. One skeleton, Subject 47, held a wooden cross fused in her hands. Carbon dating matched the skeleton, approximately 1,850 years old. She died a Christian martyr, clutching her faith as her last act of defiance. The Colosseum was more than a gladiator arena. It was a systematic execution facility, where cruelty was methodical, ritualized, and entertainment-driven. And yet, the suffering of these women inadvertently preserved the very texts that would help Christianity flourish. The Roman Empire, once thought invincible, began to crumble not simply from war or politics, but from the weight of its own brutality. The deaths of captives like Blondina exposed moral contradictions that reverberated through time, ultimately shaping laws, beliefs, and the empire itself. Today, UNESCO protects multiple burial sites around the Colosseum. A plaque added in 2020 honors the nameless victims, reminding visitors that behind the grandeur and spectacle lay unspeakable human suffering. Their voices were silenced for centuries, but through history, archaeology, and faith, they continue to speak to us. The Colosseum stands today as a monument of power, engineering, and spectacle. Marble and stone, arches and corridors. But beneath it lies a story that textbooks often omit: systematic cruelty, ritualized suffering, and human endurance, Blondina's courage echoes through centuries. A 15-year-old girl facing execution not once, but repeatedly, who defied both Roman cruelty and the twisted expectations of the arena. Her faith, defiance, and ultimate martyrdom left an indelible mark on history. The archaeological evidence, from the 2019 discoveries to the 173 skeletons in the hidden burial chamber, paints a picture far darker than any gladiatorial combat scene could suggest. These women weren't just victims, they were captives, ritual participants, and martyrs whose lives and deaths shaped law, faith, and even the collapse of imperial norms. It's a paradox of history. The Romans sought to erase Christianity through brutal executions, yet these acts preserved it. Letters detailing the games, martyrdom accounts, and eyewitness stories were copied endlessly. Spreading hope and faith, Rome's cruelty became its own undoing. The reforms that followed legal acknowledgement that certain executions were cruel, restrictions on female captives in the arena, and the eventual banning of gladiatorial games did not emerge from empathy alone. They emerged from societal pressure, logistical strain, and the unstoppable rise of a new belief system. Today, the Colosseum is visited by millions, a symbol of Rome's grandeur, but also, silently, a memorial to those whose lives were sacrificed for spectacle. UNESCO preserves the burial sites, and plaques honor the nameless victims whose suffering is etched into history. So, here's the question that lingers: should modern Rome and the institutions that succeeded it acknowledge or apologize for these atrocities? Some argue the events are ancient history, beyond modern responsibility. Others say recognition matters, even centuries later, as a gesture of moral accountability. The story of Blondina, the women of the arenas, and even the monk Telemachus is a testament to resilience. Their voices may have been silenced, their bodies subjected to unimaginable horror, but their legacy influenced laws, faith, and the moral consciousness of an empire. History is messy. History is painful. History sometimes teaches us that even the darkest acts can create unexpected change. And if you remember only one thing, the Colosseum was never just a stage for gladiators. It was a crucible where courage, faith, and human spirit met cruelty and sometimes triumphed against it.